I'm joined now by Sir Niall Ferguson, Times columnist and historian. Neil, good morning.
Good morning, Hugo.
Very good to have you on the show. Before we get started, let's get one thing out of the way. Someone's been in touch complaining that I'm pronouncing your name Neil. It is pronounced Neil, right?
You grew up in Scotland, so you know that we Scots pronounce the name correctly, and it's the Irish who erroneously say Nile. That's a river in Egypt, Ireland.
About what percent of the time when speaking to you do people get it wrong?
50%, roughly.
Well, 50 is pretty good, I reckon. Look, it's great to have you on the show. Let's crack on. There's an awful lot I want to cover with you. Leading the Times right now, there's the headline, Starmer had handed 5-week reprieve from Trump's steel tariffs. Basically, the White House said last night that the UK was going to be spared Donald Trump's new 50% import tariffs on steel, which come into effect for the rest of the world from today. Instead, the UK levy is going to stay at 25%, but that's only until July, to give us time to implement this UK-US trade deal that was agreed last month with great fanfare. Gareth Stace from UK Steel spoke to Stig Abel and Kate McCann on Times Radio Breakfast.
You're describing a roller coaster ride of uncertainty that we have experienced over the last months, weeks, and now days. So that's the situation. We've woken up this morning. We're still paying 25%, but we don't have that increase to 50%. That's a real welcome pause in that uncertainty. But much remains to do. You know, the government still needs to finalise its deal with the US that the Prime Minister agreed on the 8th of May, so we can enjoy no tariffs on all our exports into the US market, which is a really important market for us. It's our second biggest export market.
Neil, how should we interpret all this for the UK? Is this a good outcome for us that we've got a better deal than elsewhere, or is there just a sort of flickering dial of chaos and we're briefly on the right end of it?
The latter, I think. Trade policy uncertainty is the name of the game. Trump has constantly since April the 2nd, indeed even before April the 2nd, created uncertainty about US trade policy. And that uncertainty has all kinds of adverse effects. The United Kingdom is in a better position than at the other end of the spectrum, China. At the end of all of this, if there ever is an end to it, the UK will certainly face lower tariffs than China, and it may face lower tariffs on exports to the US than most countries. Why? Well, because Donald Trump has a soft spot for this country, even though it's not really reciprocated, but also because the UK isn't a massive exporter of anything terribly much to the US. It's not a huge part of the US problem, if you think the problem is the current account deficit. So for those reasons, the UK was cut some slack. The other reason, of course, was that Trump needed to show that he could get some trade deals done in that period after April 2nd, when negotiations were supposed to happen. You'll have noticed there haven't been exactly a lot of these trade deals announced since the stay of execution on April 9th, when Trump postponed his reciprocal tariffs for 90 days. It's all a bit like that old TV series Soap, which used to begin with an outline of the previous week's events and ended confused. You will be. I mean, confused by Donald Trump trade policy. You will be.
I mean, are we confused because he wants us to be confused? Is this the art of the deal that you say you've agreed something? So we did this deal with the US, and now it seems like we're still sort of renegotiating it. Actually, it's not nailed down. We need this pause and that pause while the details get ironed out. Is this the art of the deal? Is this keeping us on our toes so he can get a better deal, or is this, as I said at the start, just chaos?
Commentators love to look for a strategic concept when they're analyzing Trump's actions. But I remember Henry Kissinger saying to me once after he had met with Trump, the president has no strategic concept. He thinks only of transactions. And I think that's right. Trump is a transactional individual with only a vague, if any, strategic concept. His utility function is basically to lead the news every day. And the fact that we're talking about him now means he's winning, because that's how really Trump defines success. If you think about the economics for even 30 seconds, you can see that it can't be helpful to the United States to erect very high tariffs on imports and then postpone them and then change the rates and leave all businesses in a state of uncertainty, because American businesses, as much as British businesses, and for that matter, Chinese businesses, can't make decisions under these conditions. So things get postponed, investment gets postponed, goods don't get shipped. it's bound to dampen economic activity. And although that hasn't fully manifested itself because of the way Trump has vacillated, inevitably over the course of this year, the US economy is going to slow down. And the economies that rely heavily on trade with the US are going to be impacted probably even more. So I think looking for a strategy here is kind of pointless. The strategy is to lead the news, and that, in that sense, it works.
Neil, let's turn our attention to Ukraine, because Ukraine's shown enormous military ingenuity in the past few days. They used underwater explosives on the Kerch Bridge into Crimea. Before that, there was that really sort of audacious attack on Russia's long-range bomber bases with drones that had been smuggled into the country, took off out of a variety of trucks. You're a regular visitor to Ukraine. Does these kind of attacks and this kind of boldness show us that, despite what some people think, Ukraine's not going to be forced into accepting a peace deal on terms that are favourable to Moscow, whatever Donald Trump wants?
Yeah, you've got to take your hat off to the Ukrainians. They have been extraordinarily innovative in this war. It's why they were able to hold out in the initial phase when most people gave them almost no chance. And ever since 2022, they've actually been leading in drone warfare innovation. The Russians have had to play catch up. The rest of the world is learning a great deal from this war, and it's why Ukraine, despite a huge disadvantage, is still in it. And the Russians have been able to gain very little territory despite massive infantry and artillery assaults over the past 3 years. And you can look at this in a bunch of ways, but let's just look at the broad dimensions. The Russian economy is 10 times the size of Ukraine's economy. Today, the population is 4 times larger. There's no question the Russians can mobilize more men. They pay them well out in the boonies beyond the Urals to go and fight in Putin's meat grinder. But the Ukrainians have used technology to hold the line remarkably successfully. And I think it's proved in the last few months very difficult for Donald Trump to get the kind of movement towards a peace that he had promised in the campaign trail. It was supposed to all be fixed in a day, remember? And here we are in the second 100 days, and we're no closer, I think, to even a ceasefire. And the reason for that is that Putin thinks he'll win in the end. Putin thinks he can grind out this victory. Maybe not this year. It might drag into next year, but he senses that the sheer advantage in terms of manpower and resources will be decisive. Plus, he's counting on the West losing its resolve. The US and Europe together have kept Ukraine in the war. They've only really roughly matched the support Russia's got from China, not to mention Iran and North Korea. And the US has become ambivalent about this war. Even before Trump was elected, there was a 6-month period when the House Republicans held up aid. And as soon as they did that, Ukraine began to suffer because it's really, really impossible for the Europeans to compensate if the US pulls out. So Putin's not coming to the negotiating table, not in Istanbul, nowhere else, because he thinks that in the end, the West simply won't have the resolve, especially with Trump in the White House, to keep supporting Ukraine on the scale that it has since this war began back in early 2022.
Have you been surprised since this war began about Russia's, I mean, I do mean this relatively, but relative weakness? Because at no point has this looked like a sort of overwhelming superpower fighting a war against a smaller country. I mean, Russia has not sort of, ranged the forces against Ukraine that I guess the West has been frightened of for 50 years. And it's sometimes been a bit hard to figure out why.
I think very few people thought that Ukraine would perform so well in the face of a full-scale invasion. Of course, Ukraine had been fighting Russia since 2014.
Look, you wrote recently, on a similar subject, you wrote recently that making peace is harder than buying skyscrapers. You were talking about Donald Trump's approach to this war and world peace generally. Do you think the president has learnt this in a painful way, both in Ukraine and in the Middle East, that the kind of skills he has, the skill set he has, when they map onto geopolitics, they don't necessarily perform as he expected them to?
Well, he and Steve Witkoff, his golf buddy and de facto national security advisor and secretary of state, because Marco Rubio is clearly playing second fiddle, think or thought that it would just be like real estate deals with a little bit of reality TV mixed in. But in reality, it's not like that at all. You need to have a strategic concept, and I don't think there really has been one. And B, you have to apply pressure. If Russia's in the position as I described it, only significant economic pressure and sustained credible commitments to Ukraine will bring Putin to the table. But the sanctions really have never been real. The Russians have continued to export their energy, oil, and gas, and Europeans have continued to trade with Russia, albeit through Kazakhstan and other third countries. And so there's been this kind of hypocrisy at the heart of the war effort. If I saw signs that the Trump administration really intended to apply pressure to Moscow, I'd begin to think there was some possibility of a diplomatic breakthrough. But until then, I'm afraid it's going nowhere.
Is there something sort of within Trump and within Trump's circle that in a kind of almost like a sort of naive way, they genuinely don't really understand the concept of war. They don't understand what it's for. They don't understand why people would do something that's so obviously not in their economic advantage. And so they're a little bit baffled by the motives that drive whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Russia, whether it's Israel, whether it's even Hamas. They just don't understand why people would behave like this.
I think it's more cynicism than naivety, Hugo. There are a lot of people in Trump world who just can't wait to do great, big, beautiful deals with Russia, get the war over, get the sanctions lifted. And that's the cynical motivation behind the rush for peace. I guess the cynicism also extends to a dismissive attitude towards Ukraine, which Trump and Witkoff pay little attention to, in truth, other than to try and occasionally to blame it for the war. There's an interesting attitude there, which is that the Ukrainians can't really be fighting for their independence and democracy. There has to be some venal motive on that side, and in that sense, it's not naivety. It's a deep cynicism that makes it hard for Trump and his inner circle to feel any empathy with what the Ukrainians do, which is odd to me. You'd have thought that Americans would relate to what the Ukrainians are trying to do, which is to fight for their independence and for democracy against an authoritarian empire.